Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about the Holodomor, a genocide of the Ukrainian people. The father of the Genocide Convention, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who actually came up with the term genocide, said in 1953 that, quote, "The Holodomor is a classic example of Soviet genocide, the longest and most extensive experiment in Russification, namely the extermination of the Ukrainian nation." End of quote. The word Holodomor comes from the Ukrainian words of Holod, which means hunger, and Mor, which means death of a lot of people. So Holodomor means mass death or murder by hunger. And scholars all agree and are in consensus that the famine was man-made and not a natural disaster. The Holodomor had three waves, or three separate Holodomors. The first in 1921 to 1923, the second wave, and the largest, was in 1932 to 1933, and the third wave was from 1946 to 1947. I will focus on the second most excruciating wave of them all, 1932 to 1933, but I will briefly talk about the other two waves a little later on. The consequences of this second and most famous wave were devastating. Around 8 to 10.5 million Ukrainians have died by the newest data, and that is in the 2 years of the man-made famine from 1932 to 1933. In most Ukrainian regions, more than 2/3 of children did not go to school in September of 1933 because of the shockingly high mortality rate of children. As part of the genocide against the Ukrainian people, the Soviet regime implemented a policy of Russification and suppressing the Ukrainian language and culture. With the deaths of the Ukrainian people, they were trying to erase Ukrainian identity. And if so many people died in just 2 years, then how come it is not widely known and talked about internationally? Well, the Soviet regime denied the existence of any kind of famine, and its mention was forbidden. Families didn't discuss it at home because of fear for their children, since they could mention it at school, and they were also afraid of accusations of anti-Soviet propaganda. Speaking of hunger could lead to serious, even fatal consequences. Only in recent years, Ukraine managed to start the path of awareness and perception of moral and psychological consequences of trauma and forced denial of genocide. Raisa Kotsur, a Holodomor survivor from Luhansk Oblast, talked about Holodomor for the first time in 2021. Before then, she was stopped by the fear of repression, which was what would have happened in the Soviet Union. She never even told her children about her experiences. Well, I mentioned that there were two other waves, the one after the First World War between 1921 and 1923, as well as the last one after the Second World War in 1946 to 1947. They were of a smaller scale with less deaths, but are still important to know of. So the first wave happened, not at all coincidentally, during the last few months of the Russian Republic's war with the Ukrainian People's Republic, and with Ukraine's forceful integration into the Soviet Union. If you would like to know more about the war, you can listen to my episode called The Ukrainian People's Republic, What is it? It was during that time and transition, as well as a few years after that the first wave of man-made famine was forced onto Ukraine by Moscow. This mass extermination of the native Ukrainian population with signs of ethnic cleansing was due to famine. The famine was caused by the confiscation of bread, wheat, and other agriculture products like fruit, vegetable, meats, and dairy, etc. from the Ukrainian SSR, which is short for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was then shipped to the Russian SFSR, Western Europe, and America, all under the force of Soviet Russia. The third wave was a planned action of Stalin's Politburo, with the aim of taking the remaining grain from the peasants and selling or giving it to so-called brotherly socialist regimes. Romania received 350,000 tons of grain. 600,000 tons went to Czechoslovakia, and 900,000 tons went to Poland. More than 1 million people died in the third wave. Now let's go back to the Holodomor of 1932-1933, where millions of Ukrainians died. How did it all start and why? Of course, answering the why question is impossible. It is not humane to starve innocent people, and any excuse is simply inexcusable. But something did start this famine, and it was not nature. Ukrainians, just like most people in the Soviet Union, were forced into communal farms and were not allowed to own plots of lands or houses, apartments, etc. They could not grow their own food. If they did, they would be punished and have that food confiscated. Ukrainians didn't want to work on collective farms, and they wanted their own land. Moscow didn't like that. This was one reason. Another was that according to the 1926 census, there were 915,000 Ukrainians in the Kuban district of the Russian SFSR. That is, in 1932, already more than 1 million Ukrainians. And they were actively communicating with the main Ukraine, with Kharkiv and with Kyiv. Both from the side of the Soviet Ukraine and from the side of the Kuban, the following requests began: let's reunite. Since Kuban was historically part of Ukraine, and even today you can hear people speak Ukrainian there, even though it is a Russian territory. This notion of reunion was gaining such scale that Moscow began to worry. They did not want a Ukrainian nation with the Ukrainian language and culture, so they created a famine for the second time. Starting from 1930, the peasantry suffered greatly because they were required to produce such a huge amount of bread that they could barely cope. In 1930, grain harvests were already repressive because they were very high compared to previous years. In 1931, they did not decrease but increase. This made it seem to the government that the workers were stealing wheat in large amount from collective farms, even though clearly that wasn't true, and I doubt anyone actually thought that. But in August in 1932, under the pretext that villagers and other antisocial elements were stealing goods from collective farms, Stalin proposed a new repressive law on the protection of state property. People convicted of stealing from collective farms were by law to be shot to death and have their property confiscated from their family, that is. Under mitigating circumstances, the person would be sentenced to 10 years in prison, and knowing the conditions in those prisons, it was still certain death. The convicted were not able to be pardoned. This became popularly known as the Law of 5 ears of wheat, as anyone who took a few ears of wheat on a collective farm without permission was guilty and would be charged. For reference, you can make nothing with 2, 3, or even 5 ears of wheat. It takes 350 ears of wheat to make one 800-gram loaf of bread. In the first year of the new law, 150,000 people were convicted. This law was in effect until 1947. All other food, not only grain, was confiscated from the peasants who did not invest in grain procurement plans and owned, allegedly, grain to the state, meaning basically everyone working for the collective farms. It was not counted as debt payment, but it was only a way of punishment, a way to enrich representatives of the Soviet government. The policy of fines in kind was supposed to force the peasants to hand over supposedly hidden grain from the state, but this grain did not exist. At first, the authorities were allowed to only take meat, lard, and potatoes, but later they took other products as well. Of course, what I mean by saying that Ukrainians were having their food taken away meant that food was taken away from their stores, their fridges, their pantries. It was not just that food was taken away from the collective farms or something like that. So much bread and other food was taken away from Ukraine in the first half of 1932 that there was a famine already. It was still not everywhere in Ukraine. Only around 150 districts out of 450 began to starve. But they began to starve severely. Even cases of cannibalism were registered. A man named Kovalenko from Poltava region, a Holodomor survivor, said, quote, "In November and December 1932, they took away all the grain, potatoes, everything, even the beans, and everything that was in the attic. Dried pears, apples, cherries that were so small, everything they took away." End quote. Special squads searched even people's private gardens with the help of metal probes and looked for buried food and produce that people would be trying to hide. As bad as it already may seem, the situation just got worse. The so-called blackboards were created and were then placed near approximately 1,000 Ukrainian villages. These boards said, "You owe grain." The police would surround these villages and would not let anyone out and take away all the food. Not just grain, but all food available in the village, leaving people to starve. Soon the entire territory of Ukraine, not only select villages and regions, were subject to searches that often resulted in capital punishment, as well as the complete removal of food. There was also a physical blockade of the country. Just like you couldn't leave a village, you also could not leave Ukraine to go to other Soviet states like Russia or Belarus, where there was no hunger. People that tried to enter the Ukrainian SSR could not bring food with them. Deaths, of course, were not counted or registered by the Soviet Union, and they acted like nothing was happening. Kuban was the only other region outside of Ukraine that was affected by the hunger in this way, because there were over 1 million ethnic Ukrainians there, since, as I mentioned, it used to belong to Ukraine. Tamara Konashchuk, a survivor from Kherson region, said this, quote, "People walked around plump from hunger. They were lying on the street. Mice were digging pieces of grain in some holes in the field, and people collected those ears of wheat that the mice would dig and brought them home to make some kind of porridge or eat them raw. I remember my neighbor, that she and her baby fell in the hall. My neighbor wanted to go out into the yard and couldn't. She fell in the hall with the baby in her arms and died. She was lying dead with the child in her arms." End of quote. So, what did people eat during the Holodomor? Obviously, they had no food, but they had to eat something. Well, they ate everything that was technically edible. Some of the things that they consumed were pigeons, tree bark, grass, cats and dogs, flowers, worms, linden leaves, weeds, etc. There were also incidents of cannibalism, like I said. Anything that seemed edible would be eaten. Another survivor talked about eating and trying to hide food during the Holodomor. Quote, "Men came, 4 to 5 people, appeared in the evening. They took grain and food, looked into the pots to see what food there was, and ate it or poured it out. They came every day. People hid and buried everything from them, but it was impossible to hide. They searched with ramrods, pierced everything. People ate what was available. Frozen potatoes in the field, mice, cats, linden leaves, roots, berries, mushrooms, hedgehogs, viburnum, which were roasted or eaten raw. Everyone was starving. A lot of people died, whole families. They buried them under houses. There are no crosses or monuments on them. They are remembered by those who remained alive." End of quote. People were killed by authorities for a handful of seeds or nuts they would save for their children secretly, killed brutally and on the spot. During the Holodomor, the Soviet Union implemented an information blockade, prohibiting journalists and foreigners to travel through the famine-stricken territories. This way, no one in the outside knew about it. Soviet propaganda denied the existence of famine and spread the idea of happy peasants and collective farms. The information blockade continued for more than 50 years after the Holodomor. The Soviet authorities denied it, while historians and researchers had no access to Soviet archives until the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were other ways of hiding evidence too. Sometimes structures were specially built on the site of mass burials of victims of the artificial famine, literally on human bones. For example, in the 1970s, a school was built on the burial site in one of the villages in the Mykolaiv region. All these precautions. But an English journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, was one of the first to report on famine in the USSR, specifically Ukraine, in December 1933. He secretly snuck onto Ukrainian territory and talked to the people living there. His reports also had to be secretly moved out of the Soviet Union. It was after his first article was published that the Soviet Union prohibited foreigners onto the territory affected by the Holodomor. In 3 articles in the Manchester Guardian newspaper, the journalist describes his depressing impressions from the trips to Ukraine and Kuban, talking about hunger among the villagers specifically. Mudridge testified to the mass deaths of villagers, but did not give specific figures. Here is what he wrote in the second article in June 1933 Morning Post series. Quote, "If you go now to the Ukraine or the North Caucasus, exceedingly beautiful countries and formerly amongst the most fertile in the world, you will find them like a desert. Fields choked with weeds and neglected, no livestock or horses, villages seeming to be deserted, sometimes actually deserted peasants famished, often their bodies swollen, unutterably wrecked. You will wonder, if you question them, that they have had no bread at all for 3 months past, only potatoes and some millet, and that now they are counting their potatoes one by one because they know nothing else will be available to eat until the summer, if then. They will tell you that many have already died of famine, and that many are dying every day, that thousands have been shot by the government and hundreds of thousands exiled, that it is a crime punishable by death sentence without trial for them to have grain in their houses. They will only tell you these things, however, if no soldier or stranger is within sight. At the sight of a uniform or someone properly fed, whom they assume because of that fact to be a communist or a government official, they change their tone and assure you that they have everything in the way of food and clothing that the heart of a man can desire, and that they love the dictatorship of the proletariat and recognize thankfully the blessings it has brought to them." Survivor Alexandra Leontieva from Mykolaiv region said, quote, "Women asked then, what do they want from us? They obviously want us all to die here. They want Ukrainians to die." Knowing about Holodomor is a key element to understanding why Ukrainians will always fight for their freedom and right to live. This genocide, this man-made famine, should have never happened. It should also be widely known, studied, and spoken of, so that we, as the human race, don't let another Holodomor happen again. Thank you so much for joining me today, and this is what we need to know about Ukraine this week.